First of all, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to once again welcome you at a Tahrir dialogue, which this week we've started for the first time online in our special webinar series. Of course, this is a function not only of technology, but also of consequence and circumstances given the COVID-19 situation which we're all facing. In face of challenges or not, we are committed and obliged to engage in education and in intellect with our stakeholders, be they students, faculty, or the community at large. That was the whole reason behind holding the Tahrir dialogues or starting them many years ago. Their dialogues focused on special events, special issues of importance to the community at large, and only when we can find a speaker or speakers of highly distinguished character who bring insight, information, honest opinions, and constructive approaches to the issues at hand. Today, we are going to address the topic of COVID-19, its economic results, implications, and challenges, where we are and what is next. And there are many issues that we're going to have to address. Among them, what actually is the present state of play for the world economy? World trade per se was not going very well even before COVID-19, but what is it? Is it now as a result of it? Secondly, what's the particular nature of this challenge to the economy? I'm not an economist, but comes to mind, to me at least, the challenges that this particular situation forces both on the demand and on the supply side of the economy. Everything seems to be at a standstill. In that light, since this is what appears to be a unique challenge, how should we respond to it as it is today, and what is the best way to get out of it once we can start going back to at least partial normality, if I may put it that way? Will this be a fiscal solution or a fiscal response, or more of an economic structural response? These are the kinds of questions that come to my mind and to the minds of laymen like myself. Of course, coming from the Middle East and being a Middle Easterner, an Arab specifically, I'm interested also in listening and understanding how this will affect the Arab world, the Middle East, and my own country, Egypt in particular. Many questions, and I can go on and on, but the purpose of this series is not to listen to me or to the questions I may have, but basically to, as I said, learn from our participant or participants. In this case, we have a very prominent economist who is highly recognized both at home here in Egypt, but also internationally. He is Dr. Mohieldin. He has served in many capacities. Presently, he is the special UN envoy for fundraising for the 2030 agenda. He's previously also been very significant positions at the World Bank, as well as many different institutions. I will allow my colleague, Dr. Brahim Awad, who is also professor at the American University in Cairo, to take the reins of this event and to act as the moderator. In that capacity, he will also introduce Dr. Mohieldin in a more formal capacity, then give him the chance to talk for a few minutes, and then moderate the questions and answers. I know some of you have already sent questions because I've seen some of them, but you feel free to continue to do so as we go on. Again, just before we start, welcome to you all. Welcome, Dr. Mahmoud, and Ibrahim, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Nabil. I'd like to thank Dean Fahmy for organizing this webinar, and I'm very glad to moderate it, and for two reasons. The first is the subject of the webinar, the global economic effects of COVID-19, a very important subject. And then, of course, for the standing and the prominence of our speaker today, with whom I've had a long-standing friendship. Dr. Mahmoud Mohieldin, as Dean Fahmy has said, is at present the special envoy of the UN Secretary General on financing the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. He was previously, until 3 months ago, the Senior Vice President of the World Bank. Before that, he was Minister of Investment in the government of Egypt from 2004 to 2010. Most importantly for him and for us, he is also a professor of economics and finance at Cairo University. Dr. Mohieldin is a researcher in the economic science with notable academic publications, but is also a public intellectual, an organic intellectual who engages in public debates about development, economic issues, and other current affairs through opinion press articles and public debates, such as the Tahrir dialogue that we have today. He will talk to us about the economic effect, the global economic effects of the pandemics. He will go over different aspects of the consequences of the pandemics. Let me just remind the audience of a few of them. The IMF has made a forecast of a 3% contraction in the global economy. The WTO has made a forecast of a plunge in trade of between 13 and 32% in 2020. The ILO has made extremely horrible forecasts. In fact, the latest one that has fallen just a few minutes ago is that half of the global labor force is at risk of losing their livelihoods. It has revised its forecast of a few days ago of 195 equivalent of full-time jobs as losses in the second quarter to 305 million in just a few days. So, and this raises many issues: poverty, inequality, the informal economy that employs over 60% of the global labor force, the global supply chains, what will happen with them, globalization, whether we'll see some relocalization, and then the response to the stimulus programs, and Dr. Mahmoud's area, at one of his areas at present, which is the social development, the sustainable development agenda, sustainable development goals. I will ask Dr. Mohieldin to address these, but many other issues that he will talk to us about. He will talk for some 20 minutes as agreed. And then I have a couple of questions about the main issues that we'll have raised. And the audience is invited to send their questions, their comments using chat at the bottom of the screen. I have already received some questions. We will receive more, which I will convey to Dr. Mohieldin. Dr. Mohieldin, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Awad, and very grateful for this generous introduction by you and by Dean Fahmy. Very grateful to the invitation and happy to have such distinguished participants with us. I hope that you are all safe and happy and blessed Ramadan for all of you. So in this presentation, I'd like you perhaps to follow it with me, especially after Dean Fahmy and Dr. Awad made this generous introduction to me that may have raised the expectations beyond what I'm going to say. But I'd like you please to follow it with me while I'm going to focus on the political economy dynamics. I'd like you perhaps to help me getting into the areas related to the possible geopolitical implications and strategy, whether that you can really conduct, implement a kind of a strategy, be it a grand strategy or a minor one or a specific one in such volatile and uncertain world. So I have my colleague here, Rami, who will help me in the running this presentation. So if you can stop, please, with the first slide. So it's one of those very unique moments that you see the very life of a person is very much in contradiction with her or his livelihood. These are kind of situations that you only see in countries facing civil war, major conflicts, to the extent that you cannot really maintain your livelihood while you are protecting your life at the same time. Think of all of these countries suffering from conflict within their borders, and a household breeder trying to get out on daily basis to find whatever can help him and her or his family maintaining life, and then could be exposed to a variety of risks. We have almost everywhere this kind of contradiction, that to flatten these curves, and we can really see in this dynamic version of this of these curves, that we are really in a kind of a very big battle around the world to flatten these curves. But whatever necessary measures are required to flatten the curves by social distancing are in contradiction with what is required to flatten the other curves related to recession. So if we can see the other slide. Yes, so based on the IMF recent announcements that the world is formally in recession, and we are to lose 3%, or to have minus 3% growth. This is coming from a sluggish growth of around positive 3, much below than potential. And yes, the last decade had seen growth since the financial crisis, but that growth was not that inclusive and not that high. And developing economies and emerging markets in particular didn't really see the kind of high growth required for them to maintain their objectives to achieve sustainable development goals or to enhance their per capita income. Now we have these kind of supply and demand shocks that are very much resulted in this kind of very slow growth in emerging markets and developing economies. And some of these economies are going to be seeing negative growth. And actually 170 economies around the world, including advanced, emerging, and developing, are going to see negative per capita income growth. Some of the estimates of growth for 2020 are even worse than the IMF estimates, and these projections are always constrained by data assumptions, and some assumptions could be generous ones, especially about the duration and severity of the crises that we are facing today. It's not just one crisis, as you will be seeing. It's health crisis, growth crisis. Next slide, please. You'll be seeing other crises that perhaps we can avoid. One of them is related to the food security. And while we don't have the problems that we faced back in 2009, 2010, and 2011, when we had a food crisis coupled with increases in fuel prices. We don't have this problem today because Fuel prices, as you know, are at their lowest. The production, the agricultural production is at its highest, but at the same time, we have logistical challenges and disruption to the global value chain. So issues related to maintaining the food supply in different economies, including the economies that can afford dealing with the increases of prices here and there, are facing major logistical constraints because of the disruption of the trade channels. But this is a crisis that could be dealt with through good coordination and maintaining green channels for trades in goods, especially in food products. Meanwhile, and this is unfortunately an area that will be living with us for a very, very long time to come, debt. It's not just the government debt concerns. As you can see, the household sector debts have been in the increase since the financial crisis, as if no lessons were learned. Non-financial corporations had as well very strong increase in their indebtedness. Governments of developing economies, emerging market economies, and advanced economies had accumulated debt as never before. The financial sector debts as well is showing us that they have been exposed higher, though that the banking sector around the world is in a much better shape than the period before the global financial crisis. At least that lesson was learned. The overall debt are really an issue of concern, and whatever we have seen of initiatives coming from the G20 being implemented by the IFIs are only focusing on part of the debt, only the debt related to the low-income countries, what's so-called IDA countries, and dealing only with the official part of it, not the private part, or dealing with the private creditors. I may come back to this issue because that will be shaping lots of dynamics in the future. And smaller debt issues in the past have resulted in complications for many economies. Unfortunately, and I was in a discussion just an hour ago with a colleague of mine, telling us that we shouldn't really be concerned about matters related to debt, citing a good piece by Paul Krugman yesterday, I think, the very famous macroeconomist, Nobel Prize in economics. And he said, I think in that piece, that we owe such increases of debt, government debt, related to dealing with the health crisis to ourselves. And there is another argument by Olivier Blanchard, another very well-known international macroeconomist. He used to be the chief economist of the IMF, saying that we're at a very low interest rate environment. So that in a paper that he published last year. So we shouldn't be very concerned, but actually their focus is basically about the advanced economies. If you are borrowing abroad in foreign currency, you have the foreign exchange risk. And actually, if your country is not the US, you are not really subject to that privilege that D'Estaing, the former president of France, when he was a minister of finance in the 1960s, described it as the exuberant privilege of the US, that they can, the treasury of the US can borrow, and everybody else, the holders of the dollar around the world, are contributing to supporting this kind of effort. This is not really a privilege that is enjoyed by other economies, including the Euro countries, the smaller economies of them, and we have seen the implications of such different exposure of the Southern European countries. Happy to come back to this issue. I'm trying to focus on the areas that are going to be with long-lasting impact. I didn't mention the ups and downs in the financial markets because I see them as reflecting the bigger concerns on the health of the people and the health of the economy. So if you fix that, they will be really responding nicely, especially that the banking sector is in a big shape, in a good shape. Oil prices, along with other commodities, oil prices had seen severe decline from the average prices, which was more than $60 a barrel at the beginning of the year. We have seen them touching the lows of $19 a barrel. I'm not talking about the issues that we have witnessed in the negative prices last week. That could be explained by many things, including technical issues, and they are again impacted by lack of demand. But the interesting thing, if you see the experts in this sector, you'll see them still quoting an average price of around $30 plus for 2020, and more than that for 2025. It was, I think, $35 for 2020 per barrel Brent, and $42 for 2021. This, of course, has lots of good assumptions about what will happen in the fourth quarter of this year, seeing good recovery of the economy. It's all about the assumptions here. Happy to come back to that, because when I mentioned the geopolitical implications, that is very much in mind when you talk about our region, in particular the Middle East and North Africa, or the Arab world. And it's a sensitive area when you are trying to assess the net impact of oil prices. Even if you are an importing country, of course, you can benefit in the first round. You can eliminate even or reduce your subsidies, but there will be issues of concern on the second round effect if it is impacting investments or trade or remittances, as they will be. So these are basically the figures that came from the IMF. They are going to provide an update in May. Some of these projections might be revised. I am with the view that matters could be much worse than the minus 3% in the world output, because the recovery, especially in many sectors, even if the health concerns are going to be removed, as we all hope, and we hope for that to be as fast as possible. But again, some of the sectors are going to be impacted very negatively, and issues related to travel, retail, tourism, restaurants, entertainment business are all going to be affected negatively for the midterm as well, not just in the few months. And I'm using short term to talk about few months. Midterm, I'm meaning until 2021. So if you can see the next slide, because it has some figures on countries in the region, you can see the estimates here, or the projections for real GDP of Egypt, around 2. This is lower than the official projections in Egypt. And basically my advice here is not really to get into tense battles about whose projection is better. I would really say there will be, and I wish I had that slide on the projections of growth in China. They are being revised almost on a weekly basis by tens of think tanks and research centers, Chinese and non-Chinese think tanks, and in addition to the international financial institutions. I would really take the lowest case scenario, the worst case scenario, and build my assumptions on that, and then build my policy framework for that. It's better in these kind of very volatile, uncertain environments not to assume the best. You could hope for the best, but you should be really prepared for the worst. And the preparation here is basically about injection of finance, and in a kind of a very tailored approach to deal with the negatively impacted sectors. It is not really spending across the sectors, but basically trying to identify the worst hit to provide support to them through social protection, and with the elements of the economy that will survive, and but with some sort of help you do that, and with the elements of the economy that are impacted negatively but they still have hope, you need to provide further support to them. And then there will be many political questions about the sectors, or parts of the sectors rather, that are going to be negatively impacted in the long term, what to do with them, especially if you are going to be financially constrained. In all cases, you need to provide social protection for the people, the citizens, and there are varieties of doing that, and I'll be focusing on this area in the remaining minutes allowed to me. Next, please. Meanwhile, we are seeing many shifts, and actually this slide should come after the other one. If you can show us yes, this one. Yeah. All of these problems are not really happening on their own. There are many other things that are happening positively and negatively at the same time. There are demographic transitions that we have been witnessing during the last 2-3 decades, and there is some good dividend of that demographic change in many countries, and there is some negative dividends or in some areas, some other areas. We are seeing fast urbanization with its negative and positive implications. We are witnessing climate change. Actually, these weeks could be the best ever for environment and climate change. Even the non-experts in the area could really witness clear skies and better environments and less pollution. But unfortunately, for the wrong reasons, not because we are producing in a better way, because we stopped production and we stopped, at least partially, traveling and commuting. Market volatility, I mentioned, fragility and violence are still there, although that the Secretary General first call of the UN, first call for action is to stop wars all over the world, to focus on what's required today from us. Technological change, the fourth industrial revolution, were subject to discussions, and they had positive implications like the way that we're communicating today, but they will have as well their impact on the labor market with some sort of more than frictional unemployment. And then we have the controversy regarding globalization. And that, if you can go to that slide, please. Yes. So we have been seeing some sort of a shift of the center of economic gravity towards the east of the world since the 1980s in particular, with the higher growth in the Eastern Hemisphere. That has lots of implications on the global value chain, and many people are talking about rewiring the global value chain. And you will be seeing, as declared by some of the European ministers, some sacrifices to efficiency and cost for the sake of obtaining security for some essential products and to achieve peace of mind. So, and there will be redundancies, but all of these are going to be paid as cost for securing essential commodities, and some sort of allocating or reallocating industries are going to be happening, even if they are not really in full compliance with the rules of comparative advantage. That will be witnessed, and there could be some implications on that. We're seeing that globalization will be hit in different elements. On the trade side, we have seen the decline, and the protectionism is going to be continuing unless something seriously going to happen in the future. Capital flows could be at least partially constrained, and in today's Financial Times, there is an interesting piece from one of the top investment bankers about the problems he's seeing in complicating the movements of capital, especially private equity, then where is the other element? If you are complicating trades through protectionism and restricting capital flows, and the debt issue is going to have a negative impact on that as well. What's left to you is remittances, and remittances, last week the World Bank projected that remittances on average will lose something like 20%. And in the future, if populism is going to be on the growth or in the rise, that will be as well constrained. So you have trade, investment, and labor movement constraint. Globalization will not be a bit different from what we are seeing today. Next, please, and I'll wrap up in 120 seconds, I hope. What to do for that? Well, common sense coming from KPMG and others, as be prepared that you need really to have capacity to adapt. You need to have policies, you need to have institutions, you need to invest in your people and your society and the government sector and the enterprise sector. But as you can see from these tables, the countries and the region, with the exception of one, are not in the top 10. Most of the countries are not ready for change, even if that change is positive. Happy to have questions on that. Next, please. I see, this is my job, SDGs finance. I'm saying that SDGs to your right there are basically the solution. They are about inclusive economic growth, social dimension, including human capital, health and education, environmental dimension, the Paris Agreement on climate, environmental considerations, and good governance. So we're seeing SDGs, we as those who are working in international development, not just the UN, as being very much harmed because of the neglect of one of the major SDGs, SDG 3, about health. And you can see that across the board, from developing to advanced economies, there was a kind of negligence in this part. And just imagine what will happen if we are neglecting the rest of the SDGs when it comes to equality, fighting poverty, which is going to be unfortunately impacted negatively because of this crisis, or good nutrition, SDG 2, and how to deal with the labor market, SDG 8. So we are trying to put SDGs as a kind of good recovery from what we are facing today. Happy to come back to that. But the SDGs are not just about talking about them. They need investments in human capital, investment in resilience, including social protection, and investment in infrastructure. One particular area here that I like to emphasize, the investment in human capital requires more funding, public and private, to health and education. And we need really to take matters related to establishing a universal health coverage for every citizen in each country and every country faster and more seriously than what we are doing today. Investment in fiscal capital or infrastructure, we need really to invest in the data systems, networks, artificial intelligence, in addition to fiscal infrastructure. And I mentioned that industries might be reallocated, so be prepared by your new industrial and investment zones. And finally, part of the investment in resilience, part of that is related to climate and disaster resilience, but I think we need really to consider the introduction of a form of a universal basic income. We're thinking about universal basic income in the context of the implications of fourth industrial revolution. Those 195 million that were projected by the ILO, and Dr. Awad said that they revised even higher, their figure to 300 million. And actually a few weeks, that figure was only 25 million. So 25 million, 195 million, 300 million. We hope, of course, with the recovery, the majority of that figure are going to be going back to work. But again, there will be, for those newcomers in the system, there will be many hurdles. And I'd like really with you in particular to discuss how can we establish universal basic income and how can we fund it, because it's doable through a variety of systems, of course. Yeah, here I'm thanking you and reminding you that SDGs could be the solution. Back to you, looking forward to your questions, and I have a couple of other matters that I'd like to share with you, perhaps in the context of answering or reacting to your comments and questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mahmoud, for this very comprehensive and challenging presentation. And you finished it with the SDGs, and you said that they were something like our hope to get out of the current situation. The SDGs also are multilateralism personified, international cooperation personified. And this is about the future of the international order, the future of the international system, and you have referred to that very briefly. I will include my own comment within a set of questions that we have received. We have received many questions, so without further ado, I will go over them, and I will leave it to you to select or to consider how to react to them. I have here a question about the impact of the coronavirus and COVID-19 on the Middle East very specifically. Another question about how to reconcile safety, how to reconcile the health situation, preserving the health of citizens on the one hand, and safeguarding the economy and the functioning of the economy on the other hand. And one question was specific in this respect with regard to Egypt. How could Egypt do that, and what are the economic priorities for Egypt? Another question is about the household sector. What will be the financial situation given the heavy debt that the household sector has in the banking industry? Another question was about the impact of COVID-19 in the future on tourism and the travel industry. Yet another question is about whether China will benefit from the current crisis to enhance its position in the international order. I also have a question about the informal economy. Over 60% of, as we said, of the global labor force is in the informal economy. They are bearing the brunt of the crisis. How can the needs of workers in the informal economy be addressed, and how can the informal economy be supported in order to improve its conditions, the conditions of work, and to provide for the populations, given that trade has been hampered. Now, the last questions were about you talked about constraints to capital flows, constraints to trade, some relocalization of production at the expense of efficiency. So my question is really whether this will lead to some reconsidering of the rules of the governance of the global economy, or will this happen within the context of existing rules of global governance? My final observation is about what you said about universal basic income, which is an idea gaining popularity. But a few days ago, I heard the Director General of the ILO saying that universal basic income is a good idea, probably for times of crisis. However, it interferes with how societies have been functioning all over history. Work. And work should be at good conditions, should be productive, free chosen, with good remuneration, and as I said, with good terms and conditions. We should not, he said, rely on universal basic income, but we should really work towards fair remuneration of work. I would like to know what you think going forward will happen, and what you think about this this comment that was made by the director of the ILO. So the floor is yours now, and you are free to address the questions in the way. I think that Dean Fahmy had a question.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Dr. Mohieldin, thank you very much. It was very interesting and enlightening. I didn't want to pull rank on the questioners, but since Ibrahim gave me the floor, let me just throw out a couple of points. I noticed in your very first slide that emerging markets seem to lose less, at least the expectations that their GDP would decrease less than the more advanced economies. Am I misreading the slide, or is there a logic to that? The second point I'd throw out to you is the future of the economic model, and I think Ibrahim raised it a little bit also. Are we looking at a global economic model that is more in the future weighted towards resilience rather than towards economic efficiency? Or will we go back to the old model again and then have to deal with crises as they come on an ad hoc basis? My final point is I very much appreciated your reference towards the end of your comments that the countries that are able to deal with change constructively are those who will be able to surpass or overcome these challenges. This is an issue that I have been repeatedly raising in a geopolitical sense, particularly with regards to our region here. I think change is a positive. It's a negative when you're not ready for it. Otherwise, it's a positive. And I think one of the main lessons we need to learn as Arab and Middle Eastern countries is to embrace an unknown future and to prepare for it. But I'll leave the Ibrahim and Dr. Mahmoud to handle the rest of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Nabil. It's for Dr. Mahmoud to reply.
Right, thank you so much. And until Rami brings back this table from the IMF on the developing economies and the advanced economies, let me try to answer some of the many questions and comments. In terms of the multilateral system, international cooperation, and yeah, the following slide, please, not this one. The one that had the table. Yeah. No. Yeah. Okay. Leave it there, please. So the multilateral system is, as any other system, institution, and regime, are basically with a crisis. There are certain dynamics. Some of these dynamics are testing the capacity of the regime or the order. Some of these dynamics are accelerating change that we were anticipating. And some of these dynamics could really create new ones. We are not really aware of what's really going to be created, but we are aware of the fact that the crisis is revealing strength and weakness of systems. And that's why you see many organizations today, in a subtle way, are trying to show their presence and their relevance to deal with this crisis. Many of them are basically trying to answer, at least implicitly, a question. If they cannot really show their ability and their effectiveness to deal with these multiple crises, when then? So many questions are going to be raised in the future about efficiency and effectiveness of organization systems at the local, national, regional, and international level. Meanwhile, we are seeing that many of the problems, including dealing with COVID-19, you cannot really have a vaccine, develop it, produce it, and get it available to every person around the world without multilateral cooperation. And I know that some naive assumptions are there that some countries can have it and others can just wait. That will not really protect those, even if they are thinking of a very in a very unethical and very selfish way of thinking. That will not really protect them. So you need really to make it available, and the only way to do it is basically through multilateral cooperation, not just through the multilateral government organizations, but the multilateralism at its best between the researchers, the scientists, the private sector, the government, and private partnerships. So there is a positive area here. Unlike what we're seeing in the other dimensions I mentioned, on the trade because of protectionism, on capital flows because of the restrictions, or labor movement because of the rise of populism. Having said that, it's yet to be seen. And I think what we have seen during the last few weeks of appreciation or lack of appreciation of different organizations, and many of the entities have risen to the level of responsibility, and others are still struggling. We'll see what will happen in that, because there will be some sort of interesting assessments going forward by the different stakeholders, of course. This is on the revealing part of the crisis, and then the acceleration. We have been seeing signals, and as I mentioned in that chart about the shifts towards the east, that this is not new, that the Eastern Hemisphere had been on the rise because of economic strength. That part is not just China, it's China, Korea, Japan, all of this geographical part, regardless the kind of arrangements that they have amongst themselves. But this is a rising bloc that has implications, geopolitical definitely, but as well if you take it from investment and trade perspective, and which port you need really to prepare better to receive goods and commodities in the future, and what kind of investment and trade relationship that you may have. You link that all to the global value chain in answering one of the questions. Yes, I see that at least in the short term, and quoting some of the officials in some of the corporates and some of the governments as well, that they are willing to sacrifice efficiency, not hopefully all efficiency gains, and for the sake of obtaining the access and control over essential supplies. That's the common sense. Unfortunately, not all countries will be doing can afford that. But there is another dynamic that some of the producers and exporters today may have it in their own interest to reallocate. And we have seen by European firms, Asian firms, including Chinese, that because of some cost factors and the fact that the wages are on the increase in some of these countries, they have interest to shift part of their industrial machinery to other countries in Africa and in Asia. We'll be seeing more of that, and there will be a huge competition over that. To the observation of Dean Fahmy on the advanced and the emerging markets economies and the world output. Normally, the developing economies are with higher growth than the advanced ones, and the base is different. So 1% increase in growth in a euro area or United States worth multiples and multiples of 1% equivalent in an emerging market economy. But actually, when you see the drop and the change over time, and if you take quarter four, compared to the corresponding quarter, or the current quarter in comparison to the corresponding quarter, you'll see major drop across the board. So, for instance, the average in China, 6.7% until 2018. You can see a drop by more than 6 percentage points. India, 4 percentage points. But the hit is bigger in some of the advanced economies. The lockdown was more severe, and the implications on their services sector is bigger. Mind you, the impact on the services sector across the board is much bigger than the agricultural and manufacturing sector. And the services sector has a bigger share in the advanced economies. So that can explain as well this good observation that you have seen. But every country, the 170 economies that mentioned by the IMF, losing in terms of per capita income, they are going to be with negative growth. Everybody's losing this year. Right. On the impact on the Middle East or the Arab world, here the natural distinction between oil exporting and oil importing countries, I would encourage having this kind of second round impact. The overall impact is very negative on the region. If you take it from the recent estimates by ESCWA, for instance, the increase in the numbers of the poor people, unemployment, and the negative impact on the drop in oil prices. This is all in the short term. And actually, there is a very worrying observation that people are different from their own ways of describing the best way to protect yourself from COVID-19, but they are all in agreement of washing your hands with soap. Access to water is a complicated issue around the world. 3 billion people around the world do not have access to water. In our region, or the MENA region, 77 million people suffer from this problem. And access to soap is a luxury, if you have people suffering from poverty as well. So that's a big issue of concern. All of the arrangements dealing with this kind of a crisis, especially that I listened to the comment by Dr. Awad Tajuddin the other day, who I have a great deal of respect to his knowledge in this area. They say, well, to some extent, we need really to live with this problem. Living with this problem requires precautions, and one of them is just water and soap. And there are other areas, if you want, because a couple of questions came on that, on how to open up. There is no theory of opening up, and there is no best practice. People who thought like me, always admiring the Singapore model and how to deal with matters, but they had some they opened and then they had to close, to lockdown again, to have a lockdown again because of some cases that were witnessed to be on the rise. So you need to be careful when you open up. And some people here say you can always close with a hammer, but when you open it, you need to open it carefully with a scalpel. So I like to share with you some of the practical suggestions. And one of the best I got were really from the governor of Pennsylvania. So we'd say, well, we'll open, but with conditions, on a county by county basis. Our approach will be data driven. So you need to have data. And the data here, he says you need 50 cases. If you have less than 50 cases per 100,000 inhabitants, you can start considering opening up 50 per 100,000 per county. So this means that there are some restrictions as well from a county to the other. So this is the data approach. Second, there will still be limitations on large gatherings. It's not back to festivals and back to condensed gatherings or big gatherings. Third, protections for the vulnerable people must remain in place. How can you do that? Funding precautionary measures. Number 4, there needs to be enough personal protective equipment and testing enough. This means that you always, this is the Korean model, by the way, the TTT, or the test, trace, and treat approach, which is being used here as a benchmark in the United States. The 5th, individuals, employers, and healthcare facilities will have guidance to follow, okay? And if you follow the guidance, it's almost impossible in some of these facilities to reopen without them. So it's not really an easy method. Monitoring must be in place, this is the final one, in place so we can take quick action to contain COVID-19 if there is another outbreak. So this is what the way that you open. It's not just, hey, we go, everything is under control, and you relax all of these kind of elements that we introduced globally. Right, so opening is not really an easy method. So this is basically answering part of the Middle East questions about that. On issues related to China benefiting, yeah, came again here. Yes, I already answered this question. And then, yeah, universal basic income, and the good comment by our good friend, Mr. Guy Ryder, the head of ILO. Well, I know the view of ILO here, because it doesn't encourage going to universal basic income in a way that really could compromise any of the other rules, including minimum wages, social protection for workers, all of that. So when you talk about universal basic income, you need really to do it within the ecosystem. And it's not a replacement for anything else that the government is providing, like public education, public health. I mentioned the universal health coverage as a necessity. It is not a substitute. In the case of Egypt, it's not a substitute to what you do, for instance, through Takaful and Karama. It's an additional arrangement, and that needs really to be considered. If people are going to be employed, great. Their minimum wage will be definitely higher than the universal basic income. So they will have an incentive to leave your X amount of money of support, because they are going to have an X plus amount as a minimum wage, and then they can really be part of the network of employed people of the labor force. But if you don't have that, what you do? Practically, Egypt, for instance, introduced the system to the informal workers that you mentioned. Not all of them, but at least those who applied, they get those checks or support of 500 Egyptian pounds. So you have the experiments toward that. What if this problem remains with you for a while? What will you do? What is the arrangement? I read the other day, not just in the context of Egypt here, I'm not talking about a particular country in this context, but the Financial Times was talking, its editorial column 2 weeks ago, talking about the biased social contract arrangements around the world. That's great to have these kind of old Bismarckian models that you work for 30, 40 years and then you have your pension. Great, good for those who worked hard, and then they need this kind of pension to live on until the rest of their lives. But then, because of many problems, some of them are to do, not all of the problems that we're facing around the world are because of a natural disaster or a biological disaster or a health disaster. Lack of preparedness is public responsibility and public choice. So the social contract needs really to reflect these kind of changes. And that kind of bias needs to be fixed by having some arrangements for the younger generation who may not really have an opportunity to work. How to fund it? Please revise all of the sovereign revenues from tax, including financial transaction taxes are being proposed in some jurisdictions. Wealth tax is being proposed, new real estate taxes. progressive taxes, and other revenues that may not really be on your radar screen today, but they may need to be put into consideration. This is essential for stability, for cohesion of society, and to deal with the problem that we have been suffering of inequality for many, many years. And this is just about a critical minimum. We're not going to be making people rich for them to forget the importance of work or to gain more money through work and labor, but it's basically a kind of an arrangement that should be introduced, especially in times of crisis.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mahmoud. I think you did a very good, expressed a very good defense of universal basic income, and I personally agree with you, and I think that the Director General of the ILO, this is the mandate of his organization, so he had, in fact it was mine at one time also, he probably had to say that. However, I think that the present crisis has had, and this is the opportunity that every crisis presents, the crisis has given ground to discussion of universal basic income. It has now become a subject, a serious subject of discussion, and even the financing of universal basic income has become a very serious subject of discussion. It has gained its place on the agenda, and I think that you have very well defended that it occupies this space in public debate. My final observation is about something you have just said, inequality, because in fact, for the last hour, we have not exactly talked about inequality, but you have raised it at the end. There are those who say that the coronavirus has not really distinguished between its victims. However, the consequences, the impact has not been the same, has not been the same. The social and economic consequences have not been the same on all categories of the population. What can we do in facing up to the virus and the COVID-19 pandemics on the one hand, and at the same time, how can we ensure that stimulus packages, that economic policies going forward address inequality and reduce that inequality that already existed before the crisis, that is being made more acute after the crisis? I think we will listen to you address this, if you don't mind, and then we will come to an end.
Well, I think this balancing act between maintaining life and livelihood is a very tricky one, and it's kind of a practice rather than just a recommendation. I shared with you some of the recommendations that we have been seeing here about how to open up, because there is no substitute for opening up for economic activity, but not at a sacrifice of people's lives or people's health, because the repercussions are going to be huge, morally, ethically, economically, and financially. So this kind of a wise approach on reopening is going to be the way of handling matters. Some of the sectors, as I said, could be coming back fast, good for their workers and their employers. Some of the other sectors, if you see some of the guidelines related to travel, for instance, are going to be constrained. You mentioned in one of the previous questions a comment regarding the tourism sector. That is not really going to be one of the sectors that are going to be recovering fast because of the health constraints, the travel constraints, and the issues related to hygiene, the protocols that are being introduced, and the very hassle for those who have been traveling a lot. You know how the security in the airport changed after major incidents and disasters, including 9/11. Now, I think additional restrictions are going to be put in the time on the time of people and the cost of the travel as well. So you need really to take it as follows. The regional perspective, as mentioned, is useful. within the country, which part could be readier than others to deal with that. And then you have the sector that is essential for it to come back within safety rules. And then you need really to put into consideration what will you be doing in order to support those other affected sectors with their workers and the businesses through fiscal measures and support from the financial sector. A variety of things need to be introduced, from the fiscal packages to the credit facilities and advances that could be made as well. So the good thing here that there is a great deal of a platform of knowledge around us. And I like this policy tracker that the IMF had introduced. It's available to you and to your participants. Anybody can access that, and you can see what countries are doing on different areas of work: fiscal measures, monetary measures, other measures, in order to support the economy, support the people before the economy, and deal with some tricky issues, including debt and the support of the vulnerable people and the vulnerable enterprises, including SMEs as well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mahmoud. I will call on your generosity with one last question about what the United Nations can do to support developing countries, in particular the very low-income countries. This will be the last question that I have just received.
Well, there is an interesting piece that was produced last month by the UN system, and there is a report by the Secretary General on the socio-economic measures dealing with COVID-19, and there is a policy brief as well on debt management. So you put all of these socio-economic measures, which are basically three windows. What can we do to deal with the health implications? This is the first priority. The second is basically about what you are doing in the short term in social protection, supporting SMEs in coordination between the resident coordinators of the UN system and UNDP and the IFIs, including the regional ones and governments. And then the third, which is basically what I tried to emphasize, that you need to recover well by linking your efforts today to the efforts related to the 2030 agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, to recover well for the long term, to have the recovery more inclusive than what we did in the past. I think one of the main observations related to the global financial crisis, as bad as it was, but it's very much smaller to whatever we are facing today, that you can really win in the measures that you are dealing with in the global financial problem, but the cure will not really that inclusive, so we're suffering from it. I hope that we are learning from this mistake of the past. When you are building, you build better by being more inclusive. And I think the UN, along with the multilateral system, including the IFIs, are doing what they can for the low-income countries. They have some good attention, at least on the debt side. What is concerning me today is the fact that we don't really have sufficient measures still for the middle-income countries and involving the private sector in a well-coordinated manner to deal with issues like debt, investment, and the recovery. So the focus, for the good reasons, of course, for the low-income countries, and they need all the help because of poverty, because of lack of constraints, and many of these countries are indebted. But the middle-income countries as well are host of hundreds of millions of extremely poor people, and we need really to pay attention to their problems before they get into a crisis level.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mahmoud. This was an extremely interesting webinar. You have made a very comprehensive presentation, which raised interest in the audience. We had a large audience, and we received many questions. And in fact, we have gone beyond the hour that was allocated to us. So thank you very much for your presence and for the presentation, for your ideas, and for your answers to the questions that were raised. I think that we can be satisfied with this webinar. I personally took part in many Tahrir dialogues, either as panelists or as moderators since 2011. This is the first time I do a webinar. I think it worked quite well. We will do more of them, and you will be all invited to join us either as speakers or as attendees. I'd like to also, but yes, you will be welcome, hopefully soon. And I'd like to particularly thank also the audience for being with us, for following the presentation, for raising questions, and for remaining with us until this hour. So again, thank you, and have a good day for you in Washington, D.C., a good late afternoon, and iftar in Cairo.
Inshallah. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks to you, to Dean, Fahmy, and to all of the participants.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you very
Mohammed. Thank you very much.
Thank you.